Snow came in sideways that morning, whispering under the doors, turning the yard into a sheet of quiet. I went to the barn to fetch kindling and found it instead. A white dress hanging from a beam, its lace dripping with melted snow like a veil that had learned to weep. I live where the creek runs crooked and the wind knows my name. The house is small, the barn older than my bones remember, and winter arrives early the way grief does when you open the wrong drawer. Folks in Mill Creek still nod when they pass me in town, still ask if I need salt, matches, or company. I tell them I have enough of each. It's almost true. On the day I found the dress, the power had blinked twice, the stove was sulking, and I'd been thinking about my mother's hands, how they softened whatever they held. I wasn't thinking about weddings or barns, or the way snow finds any crack to make itself at home. Then the door swung inward on the wind and I looked up. Chapter 1. The dress in the rafters. Almost equals 1,000 words. The barn always sounds like it's praying in winter. Wood speaks to wood, nails remember their vows, and the roof answers in the slow language of beams. I stepped into that hush and felt the old chill move through the boards into my boots. The light was thin, the kind that forgives more than it reveals. And still there it was, white against the dusk of the rafters, a dress swaying as if someone had breathed it into motion. I didn't move at first. I just watched it. Lace along the hem, tiny pearl buttons marching up the back, sleeves like long pale sighs. The skirt gathered and fell, heavy with meltwater. Every time a drop let go, it whispered down through the cold and shattered on the floor as a sound too soft to be named. Snow must have come through the seam where the roof and sky hold hands badly. It must have found the dress, rested in the lace, and then remembered itself as water. "What are you doing here?" I asked it, as if the dress were a person who knew my father's shortcuts and my mother's recipes. Of course it didn't answer. Dresses keep their own counsel. But a small wind found me, and the bodice turned a fraction like it was trying to listen. I set the kindling basket down by the door. The straw there had stiffened into pale needles. Feed sacks leaned against the far stall, their twine grayed with years. My father once kept a lantern on the middle beam, the one that holds all the others honest. It wasn't there anymore. Nothing old stays where you left it. But a nail still jutted from the wood like a finger, and the dress hung from that nail by a loop of ribbon that matched nothing in the barn. We don't keep wedding dresses on a farm. We keep rope, harness, rust, and sometimes truth. Dresses like this belong in cedar and tissue, not above a floor salted with mouse prints and thaw. And yet it looked right here. Not safe, not proper, but right the way a candle looks right in a storm. I found a ladder in the shadow of the east stall and dragged it until it pressed its crooked spine against the beam. I touched the first rung with my boot and listened. Old wood will tell you if it remembers how to hold. Remembered. Hand over hand, breath kept small in the chest. I climbed. Halfway up I could read the lace. Tiny roses, careful leaves, a border so delicate it might have learned to grow in snow. At the dress I stopped. The fabric was cold enough to bite the pads of my fingers. I lifted a bit of the hem and felt water run through the lace into my sleeve. Winter's handwriting. The bodice met my hand with a firmness that made me think of the person it once fitted. Shoulders straight, nerves tucked into a smile. Up close, the pearly buttons weren't pearls at all, just glass cleverly taught to shine. Someone had known how to make a thing look like what the heart wanted. There, just inside the collar, I found it. A stitch of blue thread hidden beneath the edge. One stitch only, small as a secret. My mother used blue for mending things that weren't ready to admit they were broken. I learned the color before I learned my own name. Seeing it made the air thinner. "Whose?" I whispered as if the beam might know. The barn answered in its usual voice, a groan made gentle by distance. I eased the hanger off the nail and brought the dress down rung by rung, the skirt brushing my knees like a shy apology. On the ground it looked bigger and somehow more private. I spread it over the work table where my father once straightened horseshoes and letters. The water had left tiny darks in the lace like a sky learning stars. The zipper was old, its little brass tongue stubborn with cold. There was a pocket sewn into the lining, a sin against the proper rules of dresses. Practicality where romance was meant to live. I slid my fingers along the seam until they found the hidden opening. Inside, a soft rectangle wrapped in waxed paper, the edges softened by years. My heart climbed the ladder I just climbed and then forgot to come back down. The paper released itself with a sound like breath out of winter. An envelope. Yellowed, careful, my surname at the center in a hand that wasn't my father's. The ink had faded to that river water brown old letters where, on the back, a dab of sealing wax long ago broken. I could smell the ghost of something. Lavender, perhaps, or the cedar from a chest that sat for decades in a dark corner of a bedroom that no longer knows footsteps. I didn't open it. Not yet. I have learned that a letter changes the room the second it becomes a letter you have read. Until then, it is a companion with good manners. The dress watched me from the table with its blank bodice and unblinking buttons. There was a stain low along the hem. Grass? No, winter grass leaves no green. A darker crescent instead, as if a knee once knelt in a place that didn't want to be remembered. I held the envelope to the light. The paper hid its truth the way a face can, giving away only the shape of what's inside. One sheet folded twice, maybe two. My hands warmed the air around the thing. I set it down and reached instead for the zipper. Up, down, up. Metal remembering motion slowly. The lining gave with a sigh. More blue stitches appeared, spare and neat, holding the inner life of the dress to the outer. Woman to world. The blue was newer than the lace. Whoever wore this had changed her mind about something. I thought of the town's old stories. Weddings postponed, weddings hurried, a groom who returned from the road with new sins and old apologies. A girl who left her bouquet on a grave. The way snow erases footprints in the order it chooses. I thought of my own mother standing at a sink with her sleeves rolled, water running over her wrists like forgiveness that can't bring itself to stop. She never told me all of it. The women in my family built a house out of quiet and let the wind live there. I learned the rooms by listening to doors that never closed. I lifted the dress to my shoulder, felt the weight of it. A wedding is heavier than a funeral in the arms. I know this now. You carry all that hope. You carry what you're willing to promise. You carry what won't be known for years. Whoever walked in this had been strong enough to look like gentle. The envelope lay on the table in the shape of an instruction. I slid it into the pocket of my coat to put off the instruction a little longer. I wanted the barn to teach me first. It obliged by offering a draft that lifted the hem just enough to show a torn thread near the side seam. A loose end. It tickled the air like a nerve. I pinched it and held it still. If I pulled, the seam would run. If I left it, the world would tug at it until it told its story without me. Not today, I told it and tucked the loose bit unhelpfully back where it had begun. I found a clean sheet, or the closest thing to one, and spread it over the hay bale by the window to make a place for the dress to rest. The pane there is wavy with age, so the snow outside looked like water. The white on white made the lace seem alive, like frost had been persuaded to hold the shape of love for a while. When I went to lift the dress again, a sound stopped me. Not the roof, not the wind. A shift of weight just outside the door. Boots negotiating snow. The hinge whispered a warning. The iron latch shivered. I turned and felt the old quickness move through my chest. The one that lived there the winter we kept vigil for a man who didn't come back when he said he would. Hello. I said into the dim. The door opened 2 inches. Cold reached in like a guest who doesn't step over the threshold until you say their name. A woman's voice answered, low and steady as the kindling pile. I'm sorry to trouble you, she said. I was told I'd find a dress here. I couldn't see her face at first. The white behind her erased the edges. She stepped forward into the barn's thin light. She was older than the dress wanted her to be and younger than the voice made her. Beneath her coat collar, I saw it. A thin line of blue thread knotted tidy at the throat, as if a seamstress had tied a prayer there and sent her out into weather. We found it yesterday, she said, but I wasn't brave enough to knock. The snow did that for me this morning. I realized I was still holding my breath. I let some go. You know the dress? I asked. I know the woman who wore it, she said. And the man who meant to. Snow slipped from the roof in a soft tumble. The dress swayed once on the sheeted hay, a ship finding a new tide. I set my hand on the work table to steady everything that wasn't moving. Come in, I told her. You look like you've been walking a long way to be certain. She closed the door behind her with the gentle finality of someone who has practiced making endings kind. Her boots left a map from threshold to dress. When she stood before it, she didn't touch it at first. People who love something learn how not to hurry. It's hers, she said finally. I sewed the hem. She pointed to a line of near-invisible stitches. I do my best work when I'm trying not to cry. She looked at me then, truly looked. You are her daughter. I blinked. It took a breath for the words to turn into a hallway I could walk down. Whose daughter? I asked, though I knew the shape the answer would be. She smiled, and the smile looked like a winter door opening into heat. The one who taught all of us how to hold a day without letting it break. The one who stitched blue where the fabric was most likely to find trouble. Your mother. The barn breathed us both in. I reached for the envelope in my pocket and felt it leap a little, the way paper does when it knows it's about to become a fact. I didn't hand it over. Not yet. There are courtesies even truths deserve. Tell me, I said, why the lace is wet with snow. She reached up and touched one of the tiny glass buttons with her gloved finger. Because last night, after I lost my courage at your gate, I hung it where the wind could clean the years off it. She looked toward the seam of the roof. And because even in winter, a dress knows how to weep what we cannot. Her eyes went to the corner of the collar. She smiled again, smaller. She left her mark. One stitch blue. Always just one. I felt the old world nudge the new one into place. My mother's sewing machine, the hush of late rooms, the careful way she chose silence for medicine, not punishment. The dress watched us both the way barns watch vows, with patience and without surprise. Come, I said. We'll lay it flat and see what else it remembers. I lifted the skirt. She took the bodice. We moved like women who have done this before, not with dresses but with days. Outside, the snow changed its mind about falling and decided to drift instead, soft and aimless, like ash when the fire is telling the truth it's saved for last. We spread the lace between us. The envelope waited by my hand, quiet as a hand on a shoulder. I knew then that when I opened it, another door would close softly behind us, and we would enter a room my mother had prepared long ago and left unlocked in winter. After, I told the letter. We begin with the dress. And the dress, patient, cold, beautiful as refusal and as acceptance. Let us. Chapter 2, The Letter in the Dress. We stood with our hands on lace as if steadying a skiff in a slow current. The barn's breath moved along the rafters. A pigeon's feather turned once in a draft and fell without noise. The envelope waited where I'd set it, near my wrist, light as a promise you haven't decided to keep. Shall I? I asked. Please, she said and took a half step back, the way people do before a door opens onto a room they have pictured too many times. I slid my thumb beneath the flap. The paper gave with a small sigh, as if it had been listening all these years and finally wanted its turn. The scent rose first. Cedar, old lavender, the faint salt of winters stored and released. Inside, a single folded sheet. No ribbon, no flourish. Plain paper, the kind you use when the words must carry themselves. I opened it. My mother's handwriting looked up, round where it needed to be, gentle, firm where it feared forgetting. To the one who finds this. I stitched a pocket into the lining because every life needs a place to keep the thing it can't say out loud. If you are reading this, it means winter told the truth for me. Be kind to what comes next. I felt the barn lean in. The woman's breath slowed, counted itself. The dress was not meant for a day. It was meant to keep me from disappearing into work and weather. I wore it to the edge of saying yes and then to the edge of saying no. Both edges cut. I chose neither and carried both. That is the whole of it. I read the lines twice and they kept changing like the river does when clouds pass. I glanced at the woman. Snow still glittered along the seam of her coat where it hadn't melted, as if she'd walked fast and on purpose. Your mother, she said softly, not asking. She had a way of telling the whole truth without letting it hurt anyone who wasn't ready to hold it. I went on. If Eli ever brings this dress back to me, it means he has forgiven his feet for where they went. If he does not, it means he has forgiven himself where the road allows. Either way, the light holds. Tell whoever comes after that I kept the blue stitch in the place where fabric most wants to part. Eli. The name moved through the boards like a remembered footstep. The woman's eyes lifted to mine. She knew the name too then. Mill Creek is small. Sorrow doesn't travel alone here. The letter continued, the ink darker now. There was a morning at the bridge when I said yes to a man with kind hands and a mouth full of sorry. There was an evening in this barn when I said no to a future that would have taken what was left of my mothering. I do not regret either answer. Between them, I folded the dress and made my peace. The woman's gloved fingers brushed the hem as if to comfort it. She didn't marry him, she murmured, but to the dress, not to me. I read the last part aloud because it felt like it had waited to be said in a voice that knew the rafters. If my daughter finds this, I want her to know that a wedding is not the proof of love, only one of its costumes. The proof is the light you keep lit when no one is watching, and the way you let the river keep some names without forcing it to speak them back. If a stranger finds this, leave the dress where it can breathe. If a friend finds it, carry it home. I ran my thumb under the signature, tracing the curve I had once watched her make on grocery lists and notes taped to the bread box. The initial looked like a bird in winter, wings tucked but certain. The barn didn't change after I finished, not in a way anyone else would notice. But something in it gentled, like it had been standing with a shoulder against a heavy door, and the latch had finally remembered how to lift. The woman removed her glove. Her hand was smaller than I expected, knuckles narrow as the stems of the tiny roses in the lace. She touched the edge of the paper, not to take it, only to know it existed. She made it to the church that morning, the woman said, eyes still on the letter. I remember because I was there with a basket of pins and a mouthful of prayers I wasn't sure God needed. The snow started early, wet, fat, theatrical, and everyone said it was a blessing. She stepped out of the wagon with her hair braided back and that blue stitch at the collar like a secret. And then she stopped. The barn waited. Even the pigeon, wherever it had settled, held its peace. And then the bell rope stuck, she said. It happens in wet cold. Takes a strong arm to free it. Your mother stood under the lintel with the snow melting on the lace and looked at the door the way a person looks at a river they've crossed before. I saw the moment she heard the other part of her life calling, the one with a sick neighbor, a child with a cough, a man who needed pulling from a ditch more often than a wife needs a ring. Her mouth made the old shape of a smile and let it go. She turned to me and said, if I walk in, I will walk out, and it will break him in a crueler season. Better to break him once and in winter when everything understands. Then she kissed my cheek and asked me to bring the dress back here to breathe. I felt the letter steady itself against my pulse. And you, but the dress, how did it find the barn today? I brought it last night, she said, honest as frost. I kept it longer than she told me to. I thought I was keeping it safe from tongues. But a dress that doesn't learn new air forgets what it's for. The snow reminded me. We spread the paper flat with the sides of our hands. There was a ghost of another page, as if my mother had placed this letter over an older one while writing and the ink had politely leaned through. I tilted the sheet toward the window's thin light. Words arranged themselves faintly backward, like a memory talking to itself. Wait, I said and turned the sheet over. Nothing there. I lifted the lining of the dress again, found the pocket seam. My fingers searched until they struck something firmer than fabric. A second envelope, narrower, lodged where a careful needle had closed the way. I looked at the woman. She nodded once, the kind of nod you give a child when they ask if pain has a name. Open it, she said. This paper was crisp, less handled by time. My mother's hand again, sharper, as if the pen had insisted on its own truth. To the man I did not marry. I wanted to give you a clean answer and the world gave me snow instead. I am choosing a life that does not use either of us up. If I put your name inside this dress, it will live there and ask to be fed when I have no more to give. You deserve a house with light that is not borrowed from a barn. Keep the kind parts of me. Leave the rest on the bridge where the water knows what to do. Forgive me for interrupting your dream with my plainness. Forgive yourself for wanting a different ending than the one we learned. If you come to the door, I will feed you and send you home with matches. If you do not come, I will pray the road is mostly level. Take the ring back to the boy's mother. It belongs to the place where names are spoken without bleeding. The woman looked away as if giving the letter its privacy. When she spoke again, her voice had sand in it. He left town before noon, she said. Your mother's courage broke him just right. He bled where he needed to and then he healed. You brought him the letter? She shook her head. She did. She wasn't a woman to let her words go without supervision. We let the quiet stand until it was sturdy enough to lean on. I put both letters together and slid them back into the dress pocket, not to hide them, but to keep them where they belonged, close to the place that warmed with the body. For a second, I pictured my mother slipping her hand there during that snow-slow morning, feeling the paper like a small, solid truth. Who are you to her? I asked. The woman smiled and lifted her chin, and the light caught in the thread at her throat. The one who tied blue into her days when her hands were too tired to thread a needle. I hemmed things that weren't ready to end and let out things that needed more air. I was her neighbor and her excuse. Mostly, I was the person who learned to stand still long enough to be useful. Her eyes softened. And to you? I am the woman who owes your house a kettle of soup and a handful of stories. I thought of the last winter my mother lived, how the door had learned the sound of kindness knocking with its mittens on. I nodded toward the dress. Help me hang it where it will remember to live. We climbed the ladder together, the fabric swaying between us like a shared breath. At the beam, the nail waited, the same one still sure of its job. We settled the ribbon loop over it. The dress took its own shape again, gravity and intention making their small, steady agreement. When we came down, the barn felt taller. Light from the wavy window made the lace almost move. Water still found a way through the roof seam, but it had learned to be gentle about it. There's one thread loose, I said, pointing to the seam that had tickled my fingers earlier. She reached up without looking, pinched it, and tucked it back with the casual mercy of a woman who has chosen not to pull what would run. Some things hold better when you don't test them in front of company. We both laughed a little. It sounded like the kind of laughter you can keep in your pocket for a long road. Come to the house, I said. Soup as you promised. And after, you can tell me who taught you to tie blue at the throat like a prayer. She nodded and brushed a last drop from the hem. After we say thank you, she said and turned to the dress, fingertips quick as blessing. Thank you, we said together as if the lace could hear. Perhaps it could. Old fabric listens to the lives it touches. As we closed the barn door, the wind found the gap and kept singing a thin note through it. The sound followed us down the path like a thread we could feel but not see. I slipped the ring of the door latch into place and looked back once. The dress hung quiet, not as a ghost, but as a decision that had learned to rest. On the way to the house, the snow eased to a fine sift, like flour shaken through a sieve. The woman walked beside me in that silence born of work well begun. In my pocket, the letters warmed against the wool. On the step she paused. There's one more thing in that dress, she said, not turning. A message sewn where only the person wearing it would feel. Your mother told me she did it so she wouldn't forget what her body already knew. What does it say? I asked. She smiled, and for a moment I saw my mother's patience cross her face like light. Find it, she said. It belongs to the one who dares to look. Inside, I set the kettle on and watched the flame take the blue, the yellow, then settle into itself. The house filled with that ready sound of something about to be shared. Tomorrow I would climb the ladder alone and turn the bodice inside out. I would put my fingers along the seam where a secret might rest like a heartbeat waiting to be counted. I would trust the needlework of a woman who taught me to keep candles ready and matches dry. Tonight, I poured soup and listened to the woman talk about snow that blesses and snow that warns, about bells that stick and ropes that learn, about vows that can be spoken with a ladle and a hand on a sleeve. When she left, the moon had made a thin coin of itself and spent it over the yard. I stood at the window long after her shape stopped being part of the white. In the barn, the dress moved once. Only once, as if someone had passed and said, keep going. I banked the stove and let the house take its deep breath. Before sleep, I wrote a single line on an old receipt and tucked it into the blue tin under the matches. Tomorrow, I will turn the seam and see what she told herself. And the quiet agreed, in that way quiet does when it knows you mean it. Chapter 3, The Seam That Speaks. Morning split the house into two kinds of quiet. The kind that holds its breath and the kind that remembers to breathe for you. I woke in the second kind. Snow light had come early and honest, turning the window sheer as milk. The kettle clicked in the kitchen like it had taught itself patience in the night. I dressed without hurry, the way you do when you're about to touch something that could turn into a memory if you come at it too fast. I carried the ladder out before I even lit the stove. The cold stepped into my coat at the barn door and settled there like an old dog. The rafters creaked a greeting. The dress hung where we'd left it, the lace a little stiffer, the hem combed by wind. For a moment I only stood and looked. At the way the morning found the tiny glass buttons and made them shy stars. At the way that single blue stitch at the collar refused to be anything but itself. Good morning, I told it, because some objects behave better when you keep manners. The ladder leaned its worn cheek against the middle beam. I climbed until the dress was near enough to feel my breath. The lace was cold on my knuckles. My fingertips felt the story of every thread. I slid my hand under the bodice where the lining waits and turned it gently, not inside out, not yet, just enough to see where the seam ran like a river along the side. There, where a body would curve into itself, I found it. Stitches, smaller than prayer, neater than guilt. A line sewn with the same blue my mother kept for the tender places. I took off my gloves. The needlework warmed under my skin, and in that warmth I felt something like a pulse. "Here we are," I said, though I was mostly talking to my hands. I unhooked the ribbon from the nail and brought the dress down, careful not to let the skirt touch the floor. Laid it on the work table where the wood had already learned to be kind. The air smelled of rope and old hay, and somewhere under that, the clean bite of frost. I found the seam again. The thread's tail had been tucked with the kind of humility that understands its own importance. I had to fetch my mother's spectacles from the kitchen drawer, the ones with the scratch in the left lens that makes people look briefly wind-blown. Back in the barn, I perched them on my nose and bent until the world was all thread and weave and the suggestion of letters rising in the cloth the way words do from a child who is just learning to read. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the trick of it. Letters not inked but made of stitches, shallow and sure. The color was faint in the cold, but the blue remembered itself against the white. I read aloud because I didn't want the words to have to climb out of the quiet alone. "Hold what you can. Let the river keep the rest." I put my hands flat on either side of the seam to steady the world. The words weren't a sentence so much as a way to move through a day. I closed my eyes and could see my mother's fingers feeding that blue through the cloth, her mouth keeping still because the needle was saying enough. Under the first line, another. "Do not spend yourself into evening." And then lower near where the waist would warm it, a third. "Choose work that leaves room for singing." I smiled. It came up through me from a place that hadn't used smiling in a while. My mother had always hummed, over soup, over sheets, over anything that asked for both hands. Sometimes I think that's how she kept the roof up. "Is that what you told yourself, Mama?" I asked soft. "Or what you told me with your sleeves?" The dress didn't answer. Or maybe it had already answered and I was just learning to hear it. I traced the thread with my thumb. The stitches were so small that even the tiniest pride would have split them. She hadn't sewn the words for show. She'd sewn them where they'd press warm against a rib, where breath could read them from the inside out. I found one more line far down, near the hip where women keep secrets and spare matches. "If he asks for more than you, hand him a lantern." I laughed then, quiet, but it filled the barn the way steam fills a room in winter. Rising, fogging the air a little, making everything feel closer. I tucked the bodice back and smoothed the skirt with both palms, as if gratitude were something you could press into a fabric until it stayed. When I turned, a man stood in the doorway. Not the roads kind of man. The town's. He had a postman's gait and a fisherman's hands, scars made by work, not by wandering. I knew him by the second glance. Caleb Ward's brother John, though everyone called him Jay. He tilted his cap when our eyes met, a habit that didn't belong to this century but refused to leave. "Beg your pardon," he said. Door was making a noise like it wanted me to mind it. "Wind's got a trick today." "Wind has a trick most days," I said and stepped aside to let him in out of the cold. "What brings you?" He stopped a respectful distance from the dress, the way men stop from cradles, altars, and trouble. "A letter," he said, lifting a small envelope with my name on it. His breath made the tiniest storm in front of his face. "Lady in town asked me to bring it. Said it wouldn't sit right in the box. Said it was time." Blue thread at the throat. I thought of the woman from yesterday, her hands, her voice, the snow she let do her braveries. "Did she say her name?" I asked. He nodded. "Agnes Reed." Of course. Agnes of the good hems and the sharper questions. Agnes, who'd been tying blue into our town since before we knew it was our color. I took the envelope. My name looked steadier than I felt. Inside was a folded note and a pressed flower, Queen Anne's lace, brittle and perfect, the tiny center red dot like a heart that had decided to announce itself. "If you found the seam, you found what she wanted you to know," the note said in Agnes's neat hand. "Bring the dress to the church before dusk. The bell rope's been mended. Some things deserve to be rung right once. Below that, smaller. He's coming too. All that needs forgiving is already halfway done." My hands warmed the paper until it almost felt like skin. Jay shifted, looking as if he wished he had brought more letters just to have a place to rest his eyes. "There's soup at the hall," he offered. "Mrs. Blakely's doing her cabbage thing. Not everyone loves it, but it keeps a man working in this weather." "Tell her I'll send bread," I said. He tipped his cap again, and on his way out his shoulder bumped the ladder. He caught it with a reflex older than his name and steadied it without thinking. That one's seen things, he said, patting the rung like it was a horse. Hasn't everything? I asked. When he was gone, the barn took back its shape. I reread the seam lines until they felt like part of my own ribs. Hold what you can. Let the river keep the rest. There was no magic in it, only mercy, and mercy is a magic I trust. I fetched a clean sheet and a wool blanket from the house and wrapped the dress the way you wrap bread for someone grieving. On the kitchen table, I sliced 2 loaves and buttered their middles the way my mother taught me, edge to edge, none of this careful stinginess that pretends to be virtue. I tucked the loaves and a crock of honey into a basket. The blue tin watched from its shelf. I put it in the basket too. Matches belong to afternoons like this. Before I left, I stood for a long minute at the window. The road to the church ran straight until it didn't. The sky had that look it gets when it's already made a decision about snow but hasn't told the ground yet. At the church door, the rope hung straight and clean, new fiber bright against old wood. I expected Agnes, but it was the pastor who stepped out to meet me, old Mr. Green, with his coat that didn't button all the way and his eyes that did. He took the basket from me like it was a sacrament. She wore this here, he said softly when he saw the dress. He didn't sound surprised. She stood right there and the bell refused to say yes. We're here to let it say what it meant, I said. Inside, the sanctuary smelled like lemon oil and wool. The pew cushions had been turned so the threadbare spots didn't blush in front of company. I spread the blanket across the front pew and laid the dress upon it. Agnes came from the side room, hair pinned like a hymn. She put her hands on my shoulders and then on the dress, telling both of us what needed saying without words. We'll ring it at dusk, she said, so the sound can travel where it's wanted. Who's coming? I asked. Those who knew how to keep their mouths shut when it mattered, she said, and we both laughed once kindly. We set out the bread and honey in the back. People came and pretended to straighten things they had already straightened. People came and stood looking at nothing until they remembered why they were there. The light fell the way it always falls in that church. Soft, like someone keeps their thumb on the edge of it to slow it down. He came just before the first snow decided to show up. Not Eli. The other man, the one my mother had almost married. He'd aged into his kindness as some men do, the meanness never having found a home in him. He walked up the aisle with his hat in his hands and stopped at the pew as if it were an altar. Agnes stood beside him, a small fortress. I have something belongs here, he said, voice not much more than a low wether. He took a ring from his pocket, plain gold, worn thin. I kept it because I needed to get used to not keeping it. That took years I'm not proud of. He placed it on the blanket near the dress's wrist as if a hand waited there to accept it. No vows, Agnes told him softly. Only light. He nodded, grateful for the rules he didn't have to follow anymore. Dusk came the way it always does in winter. Suddenly, then all at once. The rope looked at me like a question. I took it in both hands. Its newness bit my palms a little. Green stood ready, his eyes doing the counting. Agnes stood with her hand on the dress as if good sound traveled better through cloth. 1, Mr. Green said. I pulled. The bell lifted its throat and remembered itself boldly. The sound went through the wood, through the pews, through the brittle air and the soft parts of people who had been waiting years to be rung right. Outside, the snow began, fat and plain and unarguable. It caught the bell's voice and stitched it to the roof lines and went on, farther than I could see. 2, he said, and I pulled again. The second strike felt like an answer from a different room. A reply you didn't know you needed until you heard it. 3, Agnes whispered, as if reminding the evening of how numbers work. The third tone found the space under my ribs where the seam's words had pressed and settled there. We let it fade on its own. Bells know how to end better than we do. After, people ate bread standing up and said sentences that had practiced being short. I remember your mother's chicken pie. She held my baby while I fetched the midwife. She taught me to say no kindly. The man with the ring stood at the side and accepted the kind of handshakes that repair something without naming it. When it was only the 4 of us again, Agnes, Mr. Green, the man, and me, we folded the dress back into its blanket. For a second I thought I should take it home and hang it back where the wind could comb it. But the church looked right, the way a barn had looked right yesterday. You don't argue with a room that's finally learned what it was for. Leave it here overnight, Agnes said. Let it hear stories it missed the first time. We did. At the door, the man touched the blue stitch at the collar with one finger. He smiled, and it was the smile of a person forgiven by the day. Outside, the snow had already started its good work of making everything level. The bell's sound lingered in the air like something cooking slowly. I walked home under it, not lighter, not heavier, just held. In the kitchen, I set the blue tin back on the shelf and slid my mother's spectacles into the drawer where the spoons keep their own counsel. I wrote 3 lines on the back of Agnes's note before sleep could bargain me away. Hold what you can. Let the river keep the rest. Choose work that leaves room for singing. I tucked the paper into my pocket so it could learn my shape. Then I banked the stove and stood in the doorway long enough to hear the house remember the pitch of my mother's humming. Came up from the floorboards, thin as a seam and just as strong. When I slept, I dreamed of a dress that kept walking without a body inside it, leaving prints in snow that filled with light instead of water. In the dream I followed not to catch it, but to make sure the path behind stayed soft for anyone who might need to come after. Morning would come with another kind of quiet, and I would be ready for whatever the seam had begun to say. Chapter 4. The Bell's Echo. By morning the church smelled faintly of wax and bread, as if sound itself had burned and left something warm behind. I came early, carrying only a broom and my mother's blue tin. The dress still lay across the front pew, its folds quiet, its lace drier now but touched by the sheen of candle soot and light. The rope hung motionless above, pale and new against beams that had seen too many winters. The bell had rung 3 times the night before, yet the air still trembled with the echo, the way water trembles after a stone has already sunk. Agnes was there, waiting by the door, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "It's strange," she said softly. "A sound that large should leave, but somehow it stays." I swept the aisle just to hear something other than remembering. Each stroke raised dust that caught the light and drifted up like prayers trying to decide whether they were finished. "She used to come early too," Agnes said, her voice half inside a memory. "Your mother said mornings were the one thing she never owed to anyone." I smiled. "She'd say that." We were quiet a long while. Then she went on. "He stayed after you left. The man sat by the door until the candles went out. Said he wanted to hear the bell fade all the way." I nodded. "He's forgiven." Agnes looked at me. "You sound certain." "I am." It was in the sound. She watched the dust twist in the light. "You'll be wanting to take the dress home." "I thought I might," I said, though I wasn't sure. "The house feels emptier without something waiting in it." She smiled, that small curve that always looks like it knows more than it says. Things that wait don't mind where they're kept as long as someone's still listening. We folded the blanket carefully, the dress between us again like shared silence. When we lifted it, a small slip of paper fluttered out, as if the lace had kept a secret until it felt safe to let it go. Agnes caught it before it touched the floor. "Not her handwriting," she said, frowning slightly. "Smaller. Sharper." He handed it to me. I read aloud. "For the girl who finds the seam, keep the blue thread." It's part of a promise that wasn't meant to die with me. The ink was gray, the lines thin, as though written with a hand that had learned how to be careful from sorrow. "Who wrote it?" I asked. Agnes shook her head. "Your father didn't write like that." "No," I said. "But someone who loved her did." We both looked at the dress. The message was newer than the letter, newer even than the mended pocket. Whoever had written it had come later. After the wedding that wasn't, after the river, after the barn had grown comfortable with ghosts. Agnes took a breath that seemed to pull the dust and the light together. "Then the story isn't finished." "No," I said quietly. "It never is." I folded the note and slipped it into the blue tin beside the matches. When I closed the lid, the sound it made was soft but final, like the lid of a piano after the last note has done its work. Outside, the snow had turned fine and glittering, the kind of snow that lies to you about how cold it is. The man, her almost husband, stood by the fence, his coat open, his breath clouding. He looked older than the night before, as if forgiveness had cost him something. "She told me once," he said when I reached him, "that love doesn't end, it just changes rooms." I didn't know what to say, so I only nodded. He reached into his pocket and held out a small spool of thread, blue, almost the same as my mother's, but newer, brighter, unspent. "Found this in her sewing basket," he said. "Thought maybe it belonged here." I took it, feeling its weight. Small, almost nothing, but somehow whole. "Thank you." He tipped his hat, the gesture as weary as it was kind. You'll know what to do with it. Agnes watched from the doorway as he left. Will you? She asked. Yes, I said. I think she means for it to tie something closed. Or open, she said. We went back inside. The dress lay folded on the pew, quiet as breath before sleep. I unrolled the spool just enough to see its sheen in the light, a blue that looked like morning trying to return. Agnes brushed the lace with the back of her hand. Maybe the river didn't take everything after all, she murmured. Maybe it brought something back, I said. We left the dress in the church another night because some stories need to rest where forgiveness first spoke out loud. When we stepped into the snow again, I looked up and saw the steeple's shadow stretched long across the field. It looked less like darkness and more like a thread leading home. Chapter 5. The thread returned. The spool of blue thread sat on the table all night, gleaming faintly in the lamplight like a secret pretending to be ordinary. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like my mother moving through another room, checking the doors, humming under her breath. By morning the spool was the first thing I saw, small, patient, waiting. I set tea to boil and watched the steam twist above the kettle. It looked like the thread might if it ever came undone. Something meant to hold turning into something meant to wander. Agnes arrived just after dawn. She never knocked more than once. The road's passable, she said, stamping snow from her boots. If you're coming to town, best come early. I wasn't planning to, I said. She smiled, setting her gloves on the stove rail. Then you will. She had a way of saying things as if she were only reporting what time already knew. I poured her tea and we sat without speaking for a while. The house breathed around us, warm and settled like it had learned to wait. Finally, she nodded toward the table. You've been looking at that thread like it owes you an answer. Maybe it does. Maybe it's a question. I unwound a little of the thread between my fingers. It was stronger than it looked, the kind that would cut your skin if you pulled too hard. The note said it was part of a promise. Agnes took a sip of tea, eyes steady on mine. Then maybe we should find out whose promise. We walked to town together, the road narrow and bright. The snow had crusted overnight and every step made a sound like old paper being folded. The spool was in my coat pocket, the end of the thread trailing between my fingers. When we reached the post office, Jay was there again, sweeping the steps. He tipped his cap. Morning, Miss Clara. Miss Reed. Agnes nodded. You've been busy. He shrugged. Helps me think. I pulled the spool from my pocket. You ever see one like this? He looked, then whistled softly. That's from Emery's store. They sell to the milliners and the church ladies. But only one person buys that shade. Who? I asked. Mrs. Latham, he said. She runs the boarding house by the river. Keeps her mending box by the window like a cat. Agnes and I traded a look. The Latham house. My mother had once worked there before the winter she met Eli. We thanked him and started down the road. The thread trailed a little behind us, catching light in places where the snow thinned. I wound it tighter around my hand until it left a small mark, blue on skin like ink. The boarding house stood where the road bent toward the river. It smelled faintly of starch and lemon, the way rooms do when someone still believes in order. Mrs. Latham answered the door in her apron, gray hair pinned like armor. Clara, she said. You have your mother's eyes. You knew her, I said, though it wasn't a question. She nodded. She sewed for me one spring. Mended more hearts than linens if I'm being truthful. Agnes held up the spool. You sold her this thread? Mrs. Latham smiled, a slow remembering smile. She asked for it special. Said she needed a color that could keep a secret. I ordered 2 spools from the city. She took one. I kept the other. She disappeared into the back room and returned with a small wooden box. Inside, nestled among needles and pins, was another spool, the same blue, the same sheen. She told me, Mrs. Latham said, that if I ever saw this thread again, I was to give it to the one who came looking. I felt my throat tighten. She knew someone would? She always did. I took the spool, holding it beside the one in my pocket. They matched perfectly, 2 halves of a promise that had waited years to find each other. Agnes reached out, touching them both like you might touch a cross. What did she say it was for? I asked. Mrs. Latham hesitated. Only that it was meant to finish something that had been left open. He didn't tell me what. But she wrote a note, said I wasn't to read it unless I had to. She opened a drawer and drew out an envelope, sealed with a drop of blue wax. Maybe today's the day, she said. I broke the seal. Inside was a single line, written in my mother's hand. The blue thread binds what the river let go. Agnes read it over my shoulder. Then we go back, she whispered. To the bridge, I said. We thanked Mrs. Latham and walked out into the cold. The river's voice carried even from here, a low hum under the wind. The road to the bridge felt shorter this time, as if the thread itself were pulling us along. When we reached it, the water moved dark and slow, still edged with ice but alive beneath. The bridge planks remembered every step. I untied a length of thread and let it dangle over the railing. The current caught it, pulling gently but not enough to break. She said the river keeps what we can't, I murmured. Maybe it's time to give it something new. Agnes nodded. Or to take something back. I tied the two spools together, hers and mine, and dropped them into the water. For a moment they floated, two tiny stars in the dark, then sank slow as forgiveness. The thread between them glimmered once before vanishing. The sound of the river deepened, a low, steady note that seemed to answer something we hadn't asked. Agnes placed a hand on my arm. She's done waiting, she said. So are we. The snow began again, soft and straight down, the kind that blesses everything it touches. The river went on talking, quieter now, as though it had learned a new word. We turned for home, leaving no footprints behind. The snow covered them as fast as we made them. I didn't look back. Behind us, the bell in the church rang once. No hour, no reason, just a sound that wanted to be heard. And the echo followed us all the way to the bend. Chapter 6. The River's Gift. The next morning arrived quiet and colorless, the kind of light that belongs to no hour at all. The snow had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the world smoothed over, as if the night had tried to start everything again from scratch. The air was cold enough to sting but not cruel, only honest. I rose before the stove's last ember gave up, wrapped myself in my mother's shawl and stepped outside. The path to the barn had disappeared under a fresh drift, so I made new tracks, each step a small act of remembering where the ground had been. At the river bend, the air carried a scent I hadn't smelled since I was a child. Wet wood, thawing mud, the faint copper of water breaking free. The surface was moving faster than yesterday, whispering louder too, like something that had been holding its breath for too long. I didn't expect to find anything there. Promises sink, they don't return. But when I reached the bridge, a small knot of blue caught my eye. Thread tangled around one of the planks near the railing, shining faintly against the gray wood. The thread trailed downward into the water, pulled taut by the current. For a moment I thought the spools had come loose and drifted back. Then I saw it. A piece of fabric snagged on a rock just below the surface, white against the dark current, fluttering like a heartbeat. I climbed down the embankment, boots sliding through slush, the air sharp in my lungs. The river spoke louder the closer I got, not in words but in movement, in insistence. I crouched and reached into the cold, my fingers going numb before I touched it. The fabric tore free easily, lighter than I expected. I pulled it out, wrung the water from it, and saw what it was. A square of lace, its edge stitched in blue, the same shade as the thread around my wrist. The stitches formed words, barely visible until the light hit them just right. For what the river carried, it also returned. I stood there for a long time, the lace trembling in my hands. Water dripped from it onto the snow, leaving small dark circles that steamed faintly in the cold. When I turned to climb back up, I saw a shape on the bridge. Someone standing still in the gray light. At first I thought it was Agnes, but the posture was wrong. Taller, straighter, shoulders set in the way of someone used to weather. "Morning," he said, voice carrying easily through the still air. It was the man from the church, my mother's almost husband. He wore the same coat, the same expression that sat somewhere between grief and peace. "You found it." "I think the river wanted me to," I said. He came down the slope carefully, boots sure on the ice. When he reached me, he looked at the lace in my hand and smiled. A small, tired smile that softened the cold. "That was hers," he said. "Part of the veil. She tore it herself the day she left the church. Said she'd rather give a piece of it to the water than let it yellow in a trunk." "She gave it to the river," I said. "And now it's given it back to you." We stood side by side, watching the water move under the ice. The current was calmer now, the sound low and certain. "She wanted me to bring her light," he said after a while. Not forgiveness, not flowers. Just light. Said if I ever found my way back here, I should leave it where the bridge meets the shore. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small tin lantern. Simple, dented, its glass fogged with age. Inside was a stub of a candle, half used but dry. I never did it, he said. Couldn't face the river. Until the bell last night. I took the lantern from him and opened the door. We'll do it now, I said. He nodded. We lit it together. One match, one flame, the same blue-tinted light that had lived in this place longer than either of us. The candle caught, soft and steady, and its glow spread over the frozen water like a quiet promise finally remembered. He set the lantern on the bridge rail. The flame flickered once, then steadied. There, he said. That's hers again. The wind came gentle through the trees, brushing snow from the branches. The sound it made was like fabric being folded or pages being turned. She never wanted endings, I said. Just rooms with doors that stayed open. He looked at me and I saw my mother reflected in his eyes. Not her face but her calm, her way of holding a moment still. You have her way with silence, he said. I learned from her best lessons, I replied. We stood together until the candle burned low, the wax melting down into the lantern's base. When it was nearly gone, he lifted it and set it in the snow at the end of the bridge just above the waterline. The light dimmed but didn't die. The flame bent toward the river, and for a moment it seemed as though the water bent back. He touched his hat, nodded once, and walked away down the road toward town, leaving only his footprints and the faint scent of smoke. I stayed. The wind shifted, and the lace in my hands fluttered once, catching a bit of the lantern light. I tied it to the railing where the blue thread still hung, the words facing the river. For what the river carried, it also returned. The flame reflected in the water below, steady as breath. I watched until it blurred into the snow light and became part of the morning. When I turned for home, I didn't feel the cold. Only the weight of something gentle. The kind of weight that means you're finally holding what once held you. Chapter 7. The Candle That Wouldn't Die. That night the wind was restless. It ran its hands along the roof, rattled the eaves, and made the windows hum in their frames. I sat by the kitchen window with a cup of tea cooling in my hands, looking toward the bridge. From here, the lantern was no more than a fleck of light, steady against the dark. I watched it longer than I meant to. The candle should have burned itself out by now. It was too small, too thin, too mortal. Yet hour after hour the light stayed, not bright, just present. A living thing that refused to learn the word, enough. Around midnight I stepped outside. The snow had hardened into a thin crust that cracked softly underfoot. Every sound carried. The far-off bark of a dog, the groan of ice along the river's edge, even my own breath, turning visible with every exhale. The bridge waited at the bend, its rail shining faintly under the moon. And there at its end the lantern burned on, a single trembling flame golden against all that white. As I approached, I felt it before I saw it fully. Warmth, honest and close, reaching out through the air. The wind pressed hard but the flame didn't move. It stood still, stubborn, like my mother's voice when she'd had enough of pretending not to know something. I knelt beside it, shielding it with my hand even though it didn't seem to need help. The wax had barely sunk. The wick stood tall, blackened but whole. You should be gone, I whispered. The flame bent toward me, a small bow. For a second, only a second, I thought I saw the reflection of a woman in the glass. Not a face exactly. More like the outline of a presence, the shape that memory takes when it refuses to fade. Are you keeping watch? I asked. The flame flickered once like a nod. The wind moved around us then, soft, circular, almost kind. The snow hissed where it brushed the lantern's base, melting into small, perfect drops that steamed against the metal. From behind me, a voice. She'd like that. It was Agnes. She walked slow, wrapped in her shawl, the hem of her skirt dusted white. Her breath made clouds that hung in the air between us. She used to leave a candle for travelers, she said. Said it was her way of telling the dark she wasn't afraid of it. She never was, I said. Agnes looked at the lantern and smiled. She always said fire listens better than people. That's why she talked to it so much. We stood there, side by side, two shadows in the soft light. The river murmured below us, slower now, as though it too had come to listen. Do you think it's her? I asked quietly. Agnes tilted her head. I think it's what she left behind to finish what she started. Light doesn't belong to the one who makes it. It belongs to whoever still needs to see. We stayed until the moon moved behind the ridge and the stars began to fade, washed out by the first pale breath of dawn. Still the lantern burned. When we finally turned to go, the light followed us in the corner of my eye, not moving but keeping time with our steps. I could feel its warmth on my back all the way to the gate. Inside the house, the air felt changed. Not warmer but softer, as though the light outside had found a way in. I poured 2 cups of tea, one for Agnes, one for me, and we sat in the kitchen without speaking. Through the window, I watched the first snow of morning begin again. Slow, quiet, forgiving. The candle should have gone out hours ago, I said. Agnes smiled. So should the stories we keep telling. But they don't. She left after breakfast, leaving her shawl draped over the chair. The room felt larger without her in it, but not emptier. Just quieter, like a heart learning how to rest. By afternoon I went back to the bridge. The lantern was still there, the flame still alive. The wax had melted only halfway, pooling around the base in the shape of a crescent moon. I reached out, fingers just shy of the glass, and in that small heat I felt something. Not presence, not ghost, but recognition. The kind that comes when something inside you finally agrees to stay. I'll keep it, I said softly. I'll take it home when you're ready. The flame bent once and then, as if it understood, grew brighter. A single heartbeat of light, before settling again. That night, I dreamed of her. My mother walking across the river bridge in the same dress I had found in the barn, her hair loose, the blue stitch at her collar catching starlight. She turned, smiled, and held out the lantern. When I reached for it, the glass felt warm in my hands. Chapter 8. The Dress That Dreamed. I woke to the smell of cold air in the house, sharp, metallic, like the breath of snow sneaking through the chimney bricks. For a moment I couldn't tell if it was still night or already morning. The line between dream and waking had thinned, stretched like lace pulled too long. The first thing I noticed was the light, a soft blue-tinted glow washing through the window. It wasn't dawn yet. The sky outside was still heavy and dark. The glow came from the direction of the barn. I sat up, every sound amplified. The ticking stove, the slow creak of the beams above me, the distant hush of wind turning corners. Somewhere deep in the quiet, something shifted. It wasn't loud, just deliberate. Like fabric brushing against wood. I threw on my shawl and opened the door. The air outside bit at my skin, clean and bright, the kind of cold that feels alive. Snow fell in thin threads, each flake steady and silent. The path to the barn had already begun to cover itself, but the glow guided me. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The latch was unfastened. I knew I'd closed it the night before. Inside, the barn was warmer than it should have been, not by much, but enough to make the breath fog slow before it vanished. The lantern I'd left at the bridge was gone from its shelf. Yet the smell of burned wax hung in the air, faint but undeniable. And the dress. It was no longer where I'd left it. Instead of hanging from the nail, it stood draped over the work table. Not folded, not laid out, but upright, its skirt cascading to the floor, its bodice filled with nothing but the shape of air. The lace moved slightly, like it was remembering wind. For a moment I thought I was still dreaming. I stepped closer, my boots scuffing the hay. The floor whispered beneath me, old wood telling old stories. "Mother," I said softly. The air answered, a draft slipping through the rafters, a sigh more than a sound. The dress swayed once, the hem stirring a light drift of dust. Then I saw it. Pinned to the bodice just below the collar was a piece of blue thread, the same color as before but tied into a small loop, a perfect circle. A ring made of memory. I reached out, but before my fingers touched it, I stopped. There was something written beneath it, stitched faintly into the lace in the same careful hand that had hidden the other messages. "Light is where you last looked with love." I stepped back. The message wasn't meant for reading, it was meant for remembering. My mother's voice echoed somewhere behind it, gentle but certain, the way she used to speak when I was too stubborn to listen. The barn grew quieter, as if even the beams were holding their breath. I could feel the air shift, not colder, not warmer, just aware. Then from outside, a flicker of gold, a pulse of light from the bridge. I turned toward it. Through the open door, I could see the lantern again, burning where it had been, though I'd watched the candle die. The flame was higher this time, brighter, dancing as if stirred by a breeze that didn't touch anything else. The dress moved slightly. Not swaying, breathing. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I only stood there, one hand over my chest, the other gripping the edge of the table. For a moment the air shimmered, not enough to see through but enough to feel watched by something that loved me once. "Thank you," I whispered. The glow from the bridge softened, folded itself back into the snow. The flame dimmed and with it the faint warmth inside the barn ebbed away. The dress sagged then gently like an exhale. It leaned against the table, its skirt pooling around the legs like water finding its home. The loop of blue thread slipped loose and fell into my palm. I closed my fingers around it. The thread was warm. When I looked again, the words on the lace had changed. Not erased, not rewritten, but faded as if they'd decided they'd been read enough times. Outside the snow thickened. The world went white again, soft and endless. I stayed in the barn until dawn, sitting beside the dress, the blue thread in my hand, the sound of the river barely audible under the quiet. By sunrise the thread had cooled but it still held its shape, a circle unbroken. I hung it beside the lantern on the nail where the dress had once rested. And for a brief second, the kind of second that lives forever between one heartbeat and the next, I thought I saw her standing there. My mother, in the light, smiling the way she used to when she'd caught me doing something kind without being asked. Then she was gone. The light folded back into the day and the barn was just a barn again. I stepped outside, eyes stinging from the cold or from something else. Above me the sky was pale and wide, the kind of color that means winter has decided to stay a little longer. But the house in the distance looked different. Warmer. As if a candle had been lit inside it. Maybe it had. Chapter 9. The Lantern's Return. The day after the dress moved, the world held its breath. No wind. No birds. Just the faint hiss of falling snow melting before it could settle. Inside I kept the fire low. The house didn't need heat so much as calm, and I didn't want to drown out the quiet. The blue thread hung on its nail beside the door, a small circle catching the morning light. Every time I passed it, I reached out without thinking, like it was a charm meant to steady the heart. I didn't notice the lantern until nightfall. I had left it on the bridge, but when I went to latch the front door before bed, I saw it resting on the windowsill. The same dented tin, the same smudged glass. No footprints on the snow below, no trail leading to the house. Just the lantern, clean and dry as if it had been waiting there for years. Inside, the candle was new, tall, untouched, the wick trimmed to a fine black point. And when I lifted it, I smelled cedar smoke, faint but real. My mother's scent. I carried it to the kitchen table, set it down beside the blue tin, and sat for a long time before striking the match. The flame caught on the first try, a quiet, golden pulse that filled the room without needing to. The light wasn't bright, but it reached every corner, soft and even. It painted the walls the same color as her hands used to be when she sewed late at night, warm, careful, alive. And then the house began to remember. The clock on the mantel ticked once and started again, though it hadn't moved in months. The curtains stirred without a draft. The mirror over the sink fogged, though there was no breath to make it so. I sat very still, hands in my lap. The flame flickered once, then leaned toward the hallway, the narrow stretch that led to my mother's old room. The door was closed. It had been closed since the day we carried her out. I stood, the floorboards sighing under my weight, and carried the lantern down the hall. Each step felt rehearsed, like something I'd done 100 times in a dream. When I reached the door, the knob turned easily. The air inside was dry and faintly sweet. Lavender, dust, and the old starch of folded sheets. The bed was still made, the quilt square and silent. Everything exactly as she left it, except for one thing. On the pillow lay a folded scrap of paper. I set the lantern on the bedside table and opened it. The handwriting was hers, steady, unhurried. "You've kept the light. Good. When you were a child, you asked what happens to the love we don't have room for. I told you it goes into the things we make. Into stitches, letters, doors that close quietly. Now you know it also lives in light. The flame on the bridge is not a ghost. It's a promise kept. What we love does not return to haunt us. It returns to guide us home." The paper trembled in my hands, though my fingers were still. At the bottom, one last line. "When the light finds you again, let it in." The flame swayed, reflected in the mirror across the room. For a moment I thought I saw her there, not as she was at the end but as she had been long before, Hair pinned high, smile quiet, eyes that knew too much and forgave anyway. I turned, but the room was empty. Only the lantern burned, patient and bright. I sat on the edge of the bed, the letter beside me, and whispered, "I let it in." The flame steadied. When I blew it out, the room didn't darken. It stayed lit, faintly, impossibly, as if the air itself had decided to keep glowing for a little while longer. I left the door open behind me when I went back to bed. And somewhere between waking and sleep, I thought I heard her humming, the same tune she used to sew by, carrying softly through the walls. Chapter 10, The Sound of Thread. Morning began with a hush so complete it almost frightened me. The fire in the stove had gone out during the night, but the house wasn't cold. The air carried a faint, lingering warmth, like someone had just left the room. The lantern still sat on the table, the wick blackened but the glass clear, untouched by soot. I made tea without thinking, hands moving through habit. When I set the cup down, I noticed it. A sound so soft it almost wasn't one. A faint hum, steady, rhythmic, coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. I bent close, holding my breath. It wasn't the wind, nor the settling of old wood. It was higher, thinner, the sound of thread being pulled through fabric. I followed it down the hall. Each step I took, the sound grew clearer, sharper. The room it led me to was the small one at the back, where my mother kept her sewing machine. I hadn't been inside since the funeral. The door opened easily. Dust motes danced in the dim light, and the smell of oil and cotton rose like a memory too shy to announce itself. Her sewing table still sat by the window, covered by a folded piece of linen. I lifted the cloth. The machine gleamed beneath it, not dull with age but polished as though it had been touched recently. A single thread hung from the needle, swaying slightly in the still air. Blue. The same blue. The hum stopped the moment I reached for it. I pressed my palm against the table's worn wood, expecting cold. It was warm. Not hot, not eerie, just warm, as if the machine had only recently finished its work. The spool of thread on top spun once, lazy and slow, before stopping again. Something fluttered beside it. A folded scrap of paper, thin and soft from handling. On it, my mother's handwriting. "You heard it too." My heart stilled. Beneath that line, smaller words. "Follow the sound. It will finish what I couldn't." I lifted the note and set it beside the lantern. The thread hanging from the needle gleamed faintly, like it remembered light. When I touched it, the world seemed to pause. The hum returned, faint, internal this time, as if inside my chest. The spool began to unwind slowly, the thread slipping through my fingers, stretching toward the door like it knew the way. I followed. Out of the room, down the hall, through the kitchen, the thread trailing ahead of me like a path drawn by invisible hands. It didn't snag. It didn't break. It just led. When I stepped outside, the air was filled with snow light, that muted brightness the world wears before a storm. The thread led toward the barn. Inside, the dress waited. Still draped over the table, still pale and soft, but the collar had shifted. The blue loop that once hung beside the door now lay at its heart, threaded through the topmost buttonhole, as if sewn there by a careful, unseen hand. The hum grew louder, not from the machine now, but from the dress itself, faint vibrations running through the lace. The air trembled around it, not with fear but with purpose. I reached out and placed my fingers on the bodice. The sound passed into me, soft as heartbeat. For a moment, the fabric warmed beneath my touch, and I felt something, not words but meaning. "Finish it." I looked down. The hem was incomplete. A few inches unstitched, threads dangling loose, the kind of work someone leaves behind when interrupted by grief or dawn. My mother had never finished it. I fetched the spool from the table, sat on the stool by the window, and began to sew. Each pull of the needle made a sound, not the squeak of thread through cloth, but music faint and deliberate, like wind caught in a bottle. It matched the rhythm of her humming, the same tune I'd heard in my sleep. Time folded around me. The air thickened with dust and memory. The dress grew warmer under my hands, alive with something more than fabric. As I reached the last stitch, I felt the thread tighten. The needle refused to move. I pulled gently, then harder, until something gave, not in the cloth but in the room itself. The light changed. It wasn't brighter. It was fuller. Every color in the barn deepened. The wood darker, the snow whiter, the blue of the thread luminous as sky. The hum quieted, replaced by silence so complete it felt like reverence. The final knot tied itself. I set the needle down. The dress settled against the table like a living thing that had just taken a breath. The lace shimmered faintly, and then, from beneath the hem, something small fell to the floor. I bent to pick it up. A ring. Plain gold, worn thin. The same one I'd seen the man lay beside the dress in the church. But this one was warm, glowing faintly in the low light. Inside the band, a line of engraving I hadn't noticed before. "The light keeps its promise." I held it in my palm until the glow faded. Then I looked at the dress. The hem was whole. The seam unbroken. Finished. When I stepped back, the barn felt different. Emptied but not hollow. Like something had been completed and could finally rest. The spool of thread on the table was empty. The needle still shone, ready but no longer waiting. I took the ring inside and set it beside the lantern. The candle, long cold, flickered once, just once, before the wick glowed orange again, burning without flame, like the last heartbeat of light finding its way home. Chapter 11. The River at Dawn. Dawn arrived without ceremony, a soft gray rising over the fields, the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself, only becomes. The frost had hardened overnight. Every blade of grass shone like glass when I stepped outside. The air was still. Even the sparrows had chosen silence. The ring in my pocket felt heavier than gold should. Not a burden. Just weight, the kind that belongs to something that has been through more than one story. The blue thread around my wrist had loosened in sleep, curling now like a question mark. I followed the path to the river without lighting the lantern. The world didn't need light yet. It had enough of its own. The bridge waited ahead, half veiled in fog. The boards creaked beneath my boots, each step sending a low murmur into the wood. The bridge's way of remembering. When I reached the middle, I stopped and looked down. The water was neither still nor hurried. It moved with that kind of quiet purpose rivers get when they've learned not to boast about knowing the way. Beneath the surface, shards of ice drifted like forgotten mirrors, catching what light there was. I took the ring from my pocket. The engraving inside, "The light keeps its promise," caught the dawn in a single glint. My reflection bent around it, older now, softened by something between grief and grace. For a moment I thought of keeping it, wearing it even, but it didn't belong to my hand. It belonged to the story that had already been told. "I think she'd like this morning," I said aloud. The river answered in ripples. I leaned over the rail and let the ring fall. It dropped quietly the way goodbyes should and disappeared without a splash. The ripples spread outward, slow and even, until they reached the frozen edge. The surface caught the first light of day and turned it into gold. The bell in the church rang once. Not an hour, not a call, just a single tone that hung in the air longer than sound usually dares. From behind me, footsteps. Agnes. Wrapped in her same shawl, snow in her hair like the first signs of forgiveness. "I thought you'd be here," she said. I smiled. "You always do." She stood beside me, eyes on the water. "She'd have been proud of you, you know." Finishing the seam. Letting it end where it wanted to. "She finished it," I said. I just held the needle. Agnes nodded. "That's all love ever asks." We stood in the cold, the river gliding below us, and for the first time the silence didn't feel like something to break. It felt whole. After a while I turned toward the east. The sun was coming through the fog, slow and patient, the way light learns to arrive in a place that's been too long without it. "I'll keep the lantern," I said. "Not to remember her. To remember what she taught the light to do." Agnes smiled. "Then it's yours now." When she left, her footprints trailed beside mine for a few yards, then veered off toward the road. The wind filled them almost immediately. I lingered on the bridge until the fog began to lift. The snow sparkled again and the sound of thawing ice cracked like soft applause from the riverbanks. As I turned to go, something caught my eye, a glimmer just below the railing where the thread had once hung. I bent down and found it, a single strand of blue frozen into the wood. I tugged it gently. It didn't come loose. So I left it there, the river's last stitch. When I reached the house, the door was open just a little. Inside, the lantern was lit again, though I hadn't touched it. The flame was steady, quiet, ordinary. And for the first time I understood. The promise wasn't about fire that never dies or letters that refuse to fade. It was about how the light always finds its way home, through thread, through snow, through whatever hands remain to hold it. I sat by the window, watching the river from afar, the flame steady beside me. Outside, the day brightened. The air softened. The world for a moment felt sewn back together. And I whispered not to anyone